mean, I wouldn't be here today, like on this podcast, if I hadn't had this sort of slow reset. And I didn't know that was what I was going to call it, or these other things. I also like, I don't think people should get to that point. I don't think you should get to the point of like about to have a breakdown to go, you know what, I should slow down. But let my pain be a story for you as well.
Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I am joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, thanks, everyone, for being here. As always, please, if you're on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. We are really, really happy with our YouTube growth. We are at 3,000 followers, and this podcast is not even... I think as of tomorrow, it becomes 3 months old. 3,000 followers, or I guess subscribers, as they call them on YouTube. What do you think about that, Nathan?
I would not have guessed that we would have been able to engage with folks so quickly and find the authors to speak to. Come up with a lot of ideas. I've come up with ideas over the years, and when something resonates, you just kind of have to run with it. And this has been exciting and fun. And I appreciate every one of you who've tuned in and have been listening. So thank you.
Yeah, when we started this podcast, this was something we felt strongly about because, there's so many tech podcasts, but we find a lot of them to be very surface level. And we just thought, hey, there's a real gap in kind of deep, consistent technical discussion. And we felt that we could get that if we really grounded our discussion in reading high quality material. So it made a lot of sense to us, and we're happy to see that it seems to make a lot of sense to you folks. So thank you so much for being a listener and for continuing to tune in. It really does mean so much to us, and we're really striving to put out some high quality content. Speaking of high quality content, we just interviewed Adrian Braganza, and that is live and on our Spotify or YouTube, really anywhere you get your podcast. What a fascinating and lovely woman to talk to. I thought, Nathan, what do you think?
Yeah, so she just or I guess in the final stages before officially being published. It's Looks Good to Me, which is an amazing book on code reviews. And you'd think that diving into a topic that deep might not be as exciting as it is, but it really is phenomenal. And I think it's going to quickly become a greenfield topic like some of the other important books that we've read. And yeah, I love being able to dive in with the authors. It's not just being able to discuss stuff, but actually go in and asking follow-up questions or getting clarity or finding out like, how did you get to this title? How did you, what did you learn in the process of writing this book? It's just it's one of my favorite parts about this podcast, and I never would have guessed that would have happened.
Absolutely. I think something that's really cool about talking with Adrian is we've been really fortunate to interview some of the very prolific authors of our industry, like John Osterhout or Brian Kernahan or Uncle Bob. But these men are so accomplished and so experienced that you can almost like put them on a pedestal. Adrian is a software engineer, just like the rest of us. And it's I see in Adrian the makings of a John Osterhout or a Brian Kernahan. I think she's going to write more books, and I think she's going to be a very well-known author in our field. And so to kind of talk to someone like that younger, to talk to someone and realize, oh, maybe we're not so different. And to see, she inspires me to be a better software engineer, to put myself out there more. Right. So yeah, I think if you are especially if you're interested in like the conference circuit, this is a great interview to listen to because she's just really
she's just a good communicator. And I think
absolutely.
That's something I want to challenge. We always talk about like, what are we going to learn from this book that we're doing? But from that interview, I'm like, okay, I have a responsibility to communicate more clearly and speak, take a concept and make it so that both a leader and a junior dev could understand the thing that's going on. I think it puts a lot of responsibility on you, and you can see how Adrian took that on and wrote a phenomenal book from that.
Absolutely. So go check out that interview. And if you like, comment, subscribe. And if you're on Spotify or an audio platform, leave a 5-star review. It really does help the podcast. It gives us a good signal boost in the algorithm. But let's talk about the book this week. This is Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. This is a bit of a departure from what we usually do. This is more of a general place productivity book for knowledge workers. So we'll do our standard author introduction. We'll share the Amazon blurb. And then we'll talk just a bit about why we chose this book. And then we'll give our general thoughts on it. So Cal Newport, if you're not familiar with him, sort of a productivity guru. This is how he chooses to describe himself. Cal is an MIT trained computer science professor at Georgetown University who also writes about the intersections of technology, work, and the quest to find depth in an increasingly distracted world. He's a big name in kind of the productivity space. My wife reads lots and lots of productivity books. And when she saw this show up on our Kindle account, she was like, "Oh, you're reading a Cal Newport?" So it was fun this week for to read a book by someone my wife has heard of. The book introduction. This is what we get from our good friend Amazon.com. We're not sponsored or anything. I don't know why I call them our friends. It's a good website. It says, our current definition of productivity is broken. It pushes us to treat busyness as a proxy for useful effort, leading to impossibly lengthy task lists and ceaseless meetings. We're overwhelmed by all we have to do and on the edge of burnout, left to decide between giving into a soul-sapping hustle culture or rejecting ambition altogether. But are these really our choices? So, Nathan, if you were to read this, you wouldn't think that this necessarily is the out of all the books we could read. We say we read the best technical books in the world. It might seem surprising that this found its way into the podcast. You were the one who kind of put this in our backlog and recommended it. Why did we choose to write this, or not write, to read this book?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Cal Newport. I've read several of his books. Most recently, before this, I'd read A World Without Email. He has several others that are on basically like not getting over distracted or having too much dopamine. It's very popular in the modern podcast circuits. This is one I'd been wanting to read, and I'm like, I think it was the first book where I was like, I think I can put this in the backlog and it'll like check off a personal box and be valuable to Book Overflow. I like Cal Newport has this like programmatic computational thinking, kind of like what Stephen Wolfram talked about of like the valuable skill set. Like coding isn't that important, but actually programmatic thinking or computational thinking is. Because Cal Newport is from our world, he's computer science. I think his approach to productivity tools is also well reasoned and pragmatic, and I think it really resonates with folks in our field.
Absolutely. I appreciate the change of pace. And listeners, this is something we want you to give us feedback on. Please leave a comment. You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. But really, we say it at the top of every podcast. This is an effort to improve our craft. And so we'll seek out the best books and take the best knowledge from them wherever we can get them. And, Nathan and I are not soulless automatons who can just read book after book after book, no matter the subject matter. We like to swap it up a little, and we love a good book like Building Evolutionary Architectures or Fundamentals of Software Architecture that are just meaty and technically dense, and you learn a ton about the technologies we're working with. And then we also like books like this or Clean Coder that maybe are a little more autobiographical or have some more stories or more general career development books. So for me, I love that we picked up this book. I think it's been a nice change of pace. Not that we don't love all the other books, we do, but the variety is the spice of life. And I guess that's a good segue into kind of giving our general thoughts on this book. So Nathan, so we read the first half of Slow Productivity this week. That's chapters 1, 2, and 3. We're going to cover the next half next week. Nathan, what are your thoughts on the first half of Slow Productivity?
Yeah, so I love that we're venturing out from a purely technical books. I think a lot of us in software engineering are highly compensated, right? The work that we're doing isn't easy to work your way up through, and once you start getting into more senior roles, the real focus on high value work is not well defined. And this book kind of flips this and says it's your responsibility to figure out how to make time in your day to be as high value as you can and gives you techniques for this. And I think that's a struggle that it's just really easy, especially if you're curious about the world, um, to start getting so busy that you come up with all these little micro excuses to like chip away at your bigger goals. And yes, this book speaks to me. I pendulum swing back and forth from feeling like very proud of my accomplishments to being like, am I whittling away my entire day doing silly stuff that I shouldn't be doing? Um, so about this book though, uh, I think Cal Newport is a fantastic storyteller. He's almost like the Malcolm Gladwell of productivity in my mind, where he can tell you these unlikely stories that kind of are interesting by themselves and then weave this larger narrative. And it makes it really fun. It's the power of story. And so, yeah, like he ties together someone who wrote the pilot for CSI and talks about the slow food movement and then like hops into Jane Austen. And then somehow you're like, oh, yeah, there's a through
Yeah.
line in all three of these things. And I love it. I was just eating it up. I'm also really excited about where the book takes us in the second half. So I think this is the most excited I've been about. Like, I can't wait to read the second half of this book.
I love his use of stories here too. I am a huge believer in the power of storytelling. And in fact, one of the things I don't love about our careers is I feel like I don't get enough stories out of it. Like I would love to be like the kind of person who like just for example, when I was younger, I served a religious mission for my church in Brazil. And what I really liked about that was every day I met new people and just every day was different. And so I would love a job that was more like that, where I was meeting new people every day and having interesting stories to tell. Um, so reading a book like this is really, really cool to me. And it's actually why I like this podcast, because I do get to tell stories about my career to the very specific audience who will actually understand what I'm talking about. They don't exactly rapture a dinner party, but you guys keep tuning in, so it's working somewhat. Um, so yeah, his use of storytelling is really, really great in this book. You know, I feel called out by this book, to be totally honest. I mean, he talks about pseudo productivity. He talks about kind of filling your day with small, somewhat meaningless tasks. And you know, Nathan, what you said just resonates with me so strongly about how we need to be finding high value work. Ever since I was promoted to staff engineer, which, you know, the titles are different at different companies. I know you might hear staff engineer and think, whoa, like staff engineer at Amazon. No, I'm not like a staff engineer at Amazon. I'm more like I probably map closer a senior at Amazon, but still that's a very high value role. Um, and you have to be focusing on the high value tasks were compensated well, and you have to I'm constantly thinking about what is the best value I can be delivering. Okay, I can do this thing, I can knock out this ticket, but could a junior have done that ticket? And if so, why am I doing it? So yeah, like I'm constantly thinking about what is the best use of my time. So this book is great because it's kind of, and we're going to get into this with the discussion, but it asks us to take a step back and to quit filling our days with just emails, Slack messages, just busy work. It's a really great book for kind of stepping back and evaluating your career. And since the whole book is about knowledge work, it's very applicable to any software engineer, because we are like the quintessential definition of knowledge work. And also, like I said, my wife knows Cal Newport, and she's actually reading along with me too. If you guys think that we're nutso because we read this many books, you should talk to my wife. She read 90 books last year. All this woman does is read. So it's really, really fun that this week I've been able to read this along with my wife. Yeah, we are so excited to get into the discussion of slow productivity and everything that Cal Newport has to offer here, because it really just is a fantastic book. Please stick around for that. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll move on with the discussion of the book. And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, let's start off by talking about the thesis of slow productivity. What does slow productivity even mean? Because that's an interesting title and an interesting name for a productivity philosophy. Nathan, do you want to walk us through Cal Newport's definition of what he considers slow productivity to be?
Yeah, he gives us this thesis statement and very alluring 3-step process that he expands upon in the whole book. So he defines slow productivity as a philosophy for organizing knowledge work efforts in a sustainable and meaningful manner based on the following 3 principles. Number 1 is do fewer things. Number 2, work at a natural pace. And number 3, obsess over quality. And when I read these, it was like chills down my spine. He actually introduces the end of part 1, which is he calls the foundations. But we wanted to bring this up at the very beginning because the framing of how he tells stories through chapter 1 and chapter 2 kind of builds up to this, and we wanted to, I don't know, expand upon it because it's so interesting. The journey of how he came across this, because it's not like Cal Newport's just known this is the way to do it. You learn a lot about the mistakes he's made and others have made through his storytelling. Yeah,
Well,
I'd love
this
to
book
hear.
is actually born out of the pandemic,
Yeah,
where he noticed, he calls it the Zoom-pocalypse, where all of a sudden everyone was spending all of their time in Zoom meetings, email threads, Slack messages, and he says people are feeling burned out. Especially knowledge workers. How he defines knowledge work, he says work is a vague thing that employees do in an office. More work creates better results than less. It's a manager's job to ensure work or enough work is getting done. Because without this pressure, lazy employees will attempt to get away with the bare minimum. The most successful companies have the hardest workers. He says it's hard to overemphasize how unusual it is that an economic sector as large as knowledge work lacks useful standard definitions of productivity. So, we've talked about this. I think this is very prescient, I think is how you say that word, in a world where we're debating remote work, because you kind of think, hey, if you're in the office, you're working. But what does that mean? Because knowledge work, it's very different from, he compares it like a factory where we produce widgets and we can evaluate whether or not our methods are working by are more widgets being produced in a day than they were yesterday. Knowledge work, not so much. So how do you measure productivity? What does it even mean for a knowledge worker to be productive? And unfortunately, what a lot of us, and like I said, I feel called out by this, evaluate as productive, he defines as pseudo-productivity, which he says the use of visible activity as the primary means of approximating actual productive effort. He says many people would rather pretend to be busy in an air-conditioned office than stamp sheet metal all day on a hot factory floor. So again, you work in a factory, widgets come out the door at the end of the day, you cannot deny that result. That is productive. Knowledge workers, what does it mean to be productive? Because I know that sometimes I'll finish a morning and think, oh, that was great. I answered so many Slack messages. I filed so many expense reports.
right.
I created so many tickets.
Yeah,
Is
look at my
that
Dora.
productive?
Look at my Dora metrics, right?
Exactly. Is that productive?
Right.
I don't know. What do you think about all this, Nathan?
Yeah, it's in the security world, we talk a lot about security theater, right? Like perfect example, I've done a bunch of international travel, and the way that the TSA does security versus like other countries, it's interesting because I feel like a lot of it's like security theater. It's not like you're more secure because of the way that the TSA processes stuff. I feel the same thing as you can have like productivity theater, where you're like, look at all these little silly things that I did. I checked all the boxes. I filled out the Excel spreadsheet. I have all this. I have a paper trail of my productivity. But you're like, did you do something meaningful? Did you actually do something you're excited about working on? Is it gonna move the needle on the business at the company? And that's a much harder standard to hold yourself to, right? And it's also scary. I think one of the things I love about this book is he gives all these examples of pseudo productivity and people who really went through some pits of despair, self-doubt, and said, what am I even doing? I have all these skills that I can't deliver. And then they have this sort of transformation moment, and you realize it's making room for those, knowledge work comes in sort of spurts. I've talked about this at my current company. I was like, I'm on the clock and I'm expected to come during business hours, but I might be thinking deeply on something. And when I'm going on a walk with my wife, I have the breakthrough, or I'm taking a shower and my brain's in another place, or I just take a break and take a nap or go to sleep overnight. And then the next morning, the solution's there. And that's all knowledge work, right? Like there's processes in our brains that don't just sit there and be, they're not widget factory, butt in a seat, doing stuff. And this book expresses those thoughts that I've had for a long time in a way that I didn't have a way of like communicating. Because I think, especially with the Zoom-pocalypse stuff, we knew it was wrong. We knew that being in 2.5 hours in meetings a day, to coordinate and to understand what's going on was not the most effective way of, delivering value to the company. And so, yeah, I love this idea of like, hey, why do we feel exhausted? Why do we feel that, I'm busier than ever, but I'm less effective than I was 2 years ago when I had a very clear, a vision on something else I'm doing? And yeah, you said it, you felt called out. I absolutely did too.
Well, it's interesting as software engineers because we, in some ways, I think our productivity can be measured a little better than kind of the classic example here. I think this, when I was actually reading this book, I'm like, this would be great for like a product manager to read, because I imagine that product managers are the folks who feel more like every day they're caught up in a never-ending series of pseudo-productivity. Let's talk about the task. Let's plan around the task. Let me answer emails about the task. But you got to actually do the task at one point. It is nice as software engineers for us to be able to, in some ways, we're more similar to the factory that produces widgets than some other professions, because you can write code and ship it and say, okay, look, I made this thing. But I thought of this kind of idea of pseudo productivity a little more in the sense of like standard toil, in the sense that I think there are lots of teams who have these these manual processes that need to be done every single day. And you can crank out, like, I don't know, like, let's say we actually have one at work, right? For kind of like, we have this like customer data platform. And then if marketers want to kind of choose a new attribute that they want to know about our customers, like let's say that they want to know every customer who lives in Missouri and is a woman who bought more than $50 on the worth of goods on the platform, right? They can kind of craft that attribute and then stick it in the system, and then they can use it, to kind of segment the audience and give them targeted offers. Anyhow, the whole process of creating one of those attributes is somewhat of a manual process right now that requires an engineer to actually ship new code, which is not good. But it's one of those things where, like, once you get good at creating those attributes as an engineer, you can crank out a lot in a day. And you can be at the end of the day and be like, look how many attributes I created. Wow, I'm very productive. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of pseudo productivity in the sense of, wait a minute, is this the highest value work I can do? He leads the book with this story of, I don't remember the person's name, but an author trying to write a big complicated article for a newspaper, and how his breakthrough came from him just lying on the back of a picnic table in his backyard looking up at a tree. And you don't think that's productive work, but that wound up being the time and space he needed to figure out how to format the article. And I think about that in relation to these attributes we have to do at work, where I was just driving to Walmart last night at like 9:30 p.m. I was a masochist and had just finished watching the presidential debate, and was just driving to Walmart and had this realization. I'm like, oh, why aren't we doing this the way? Why aren't we this attribute process? I bet if we did it this way, that this would really improve things. And so, like you said, Nathan, like, as knowledge workers, one of the key differences between us and a factory worker is we don't clock out at the end of the day. And Cal Newport is talking about how we need to embrace that. We need to realize that our work is a little different, and that we need to focus on the highest impact, highest value work. And one of the ways we can do that is by slowing down a little.
Yeah.
And so he kind of proposes, if chapter 1 is the basis for why we need a new philosophy in the way we do work, chapter 2 is kind of his proposition of that philosophy. He calls it a slower alternative. Nathan, do you want to kind of take us through Cal Newport's reasoning and thinking behind, like, what a slower alternative is?
Again, this is such an interesting intersection of worlds that I've been in, partially because of some life decisions that I had made. So he talks about the slowness revolution. It's one of the things he talks about in A Slower Alternative in this chapter. And he really has the hallmark being the slow food movement. And maybe not everyone is aware of the slow food movement or Michael Pollan or some of the other really interesting ideas. This really, I think, kind of initially blew up in the early 2000s. And so I'm 40, so I was in my early 20s when a lot of this stuff was initially happening. And maybe in the 2010s where it kind of picked up a lot. I also happen to be in like Austin, Texas in the 2010s. And Austin is really famous for loving its local businesses and kind of doing things a little different. Like "Keep Austin Weird" is their slogan, which has changed its meaning in modern politics. But I still think weird's a cool word. But
I grew up
the
next to Portland, which had the same exact
yeah,
slogan too. So yeah. So I'm familiar
supposedly
with
they
that kind of
stole
quirky
it.
culture.
Yeah,
Oh,
supposedly
what?
part. Yeah, it was
Oh,
a NPR fundraiser in Austin. I know the history on this one.
oh.
But I like having twin cities of competing weirdness. I think that's great. So the idea though in the slow food movement, and he found this in his research for this book. He was looking at these alternatives of people who've decided to slow down on purpose and see what would happen. Um, the slow food movement, at first glance, seems like it's an anti-technological or anti-modern movement and says, hey, we're against fast food. We're against always being busy and just grabbing convenient stuff. And instead, we want to not just enjoy slower cooking process of food, but actually the sitting around the table as a group, enjoying it together, really cherishing this moment that we have. And out of it came something that's much more powerful than I think he realized, or even the folks who first started the slow movement would realize, is that this is where community and culture and celebrating the achievements of the past, right? Like an amazing recipe or amazing food culture came from these slow food movements because that's how you made food. And it kind of snowballed into a bunch of other ideas, right? There's slow food, slow cities, slow medicine, slow schooling, slow media, slow cinema. And this idea of like, can we slow down? And one of the things I loved about it, I think there's a quote that says, all movements built on radical but effective strategies of offering people a slower, more sustainable alternative to modern busyness that draws from time-tested wisdom. As I learned more about these ideas in my reporting on the knowledge work, a natural follow-up thought emerged. Maybe when it comes to combating inhumanity of our current moment of professional overload, what we really need, more so than righteous disdain or brash new policy, is a slower conception of what it even means to be productive in the first place. And boom, that's just such a powerful idea.
This, listen, folks. Cards on the table. I'm a red-blooded American, right? I take a lot of pride in being American, and I just am a firm believer. I know we have a lot of international listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in. I believe that America is the greatest country in the world. And so sometimes when we like, I have like this knee jerk reaction when he's like, but the Italians said, I'm like, the Italians? Talk to me when the Italians put a man on the moon, okay? And that is my bad habit. But I I really admire industry. I actually live in the state of Utah, and that's our state motto is industry. Um, I I like the kind of the American productive industrial spirit. I just read an interesting fact the other day that basically says that out of the European companies that are worth 100 billion euros, none of them have been invented in the last 50 years. Whereas with the American industry, all six American companies worth 1 trillion euros have been invented within the last 50 years. So I'm just very much a modern man, and I am not the kind of guy who looks and says, "Oh, things were better in the '80s or things were better in the '70s." I really do just appreciate all of the technical marvels we have today. And so sometimes, and again, this is just me, but sometimes when people say, "Oh, but in Europe they take things slower and they have a better quality of life," I'm like, yeah, well, talk to me when you have six $1 trillion companies, because I'm very much just I want to be big, I want to be fast. And so if you are a software engineer, you might find yourself in my shoes too. I know, it's a very kind of Silicon Valley attitude. But I want to give a plug for this book because this is not Cal Newport calling all of us and saying, hey, everyone, quit dreaming big. Everyone just settle down. Let's all take a siesta every day, right? This is Cal Newport saying, we're not focusing on the right things and that we can still do big, cool stuff in our careers, in our industry, but we don't have to be so harried all the time. We don't have to be so like engaging again in that pseudo productivity. The slow food movement is saying, like you were talking about, Nathan, right? Maybe there's some value we're missing by focusing so much on just getting food in and out the door quickly. Maybe sitting around the table and enjoying that is important. So I just think when I started reading this book, again, my kind of knee jerk Wild West Americanism kind of said, what are you talking about? No, we got to build, we got to do stuff. And I was really impressed and surprised that this book still resonated with me a lot because it helped me think, wait a minute, maybe that kind of knee jerk go isn't as productive as I think it is.
It's interesting too, because there's a little bit of an age gap between you and me, and I think that in my late 20s,
I'm 50, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my late 20s, though, I think I had and maybe this is just the arc of life and things like this too. Is that I think I resonated a lot with your sentiments there. Things have shifted a bit over the last 10, 11 years. And I actually had a burnout moment. And I don't think you've been fortunate, and maybe you just have better balance than I did.
I think it's on the horizon.
Yeah. So I had a burnout moment. I was we had a daughter that was under the age of 1. I had become the CTO at an early stage startup. We had actually gone from pre-seed all the way through Series A funding. Very exciting, wild ride. But I just kept going, well, I'm going to have to burn the candle on both ends. I was like workaholic. And I also, it hit me like I brought my daughter into the world, and I was hardly having time to spend quality time with her. It bothered me like deeply. And I think I've talked about this maybe in other episodes, but we took this little trip out to Marfa, Texas, which is out in West Texas, weird little town. You can look it up. It's pretty neat. And I had this like epiphany while I was out there. I was like, I don't want to work where I'm working anymore. And we took a step back, and we were literally, this is 2017. We were like talking about getting a travel trailer and doing the van life thing, which is before it kind of blew up everywhere, but it was starting to happen. And then my wife was like, what if we moved to Costa Rica? And so this kicked off this whole thing. And it wasn't just that we were like running away from our problems and moving to Costa Rica. I used this as an opportunity to reset. I had been an IT consultant, and so I decided I'd reach out to a couple of my clients, and I would limit myself to 24 hours of work a week. That I would stop using an alarm clock. I actually also did things like stopped measuring food and just kind of ate more intuitively and just tried to listen, slow down a little bit. And it changed my life. Like I went from being really unhealthy, super stressed all the time to reassessing stuff. And it kicked off this whole chain of events in my marriage, my relationship with my kid, that, I mean, I wouldn't be here today, like on this podcast, if I hadn't had this sort of slow reset. And I didn't know that was what I was going to call it, or these other things. I also I don't think people should get to that point. I don't think you should get to the point of like about to have a breakdown to go, you know what, I should slow down. But let my pain be a story for you as well. But again, this is really resonated with me, and I think I shifted that point because I realized there is something to the Italian culture or to the Okinawans, or in the Costa Ricans in this case. Costa Rica is not a wealthy country for most folks, right? But they're some of the happiest people, even though they don't have a ton. And I mean, they're saying there, it's even a greeting. It's a response to all the kinds of things, is pura vida, which means like pure life or pure living. And it's not just some sales pitch slogan, touristy thing. It literally is a term used all the time. And not to say that life's easy for a lot of folks, but the focus on family, the focus on slowing down, the focus on contentment is super different. And again, this chapter, like, I really was like, okay. And now that I'm back in the United States, this is my last little point here. I found the stuff creeping back in. We were actually scared when we moved back to the United States. I said, we're going to be plugging back into the matrix. Like, we've decided, like we've kind of set up this different life for ourselves. And like, we're coming back, and like, will I be able to resist the hustle and bustle of busyness? And I've been moderately successful. I think in some ways I have definitely kept that part of the slowness with me. And in other ways, I've revert back to the mean, right? I've reverted back to filling my day with a lot of stuff that doesn't really matter.
I think it's fascinating, and we're going to move on to the discussion of chapter 3 here soon. But you talk about the catalyst for kind of your reset being having a kid. And I know that's super common for people, especially as they get in their 30s. Here's my problem. I had my son when I was 22 years old. I was still in college at the time. I was a junior in college, and my wife was a junior in college too. And we would literally we scheduled our classes so that they didn't overlap. So we would meet back and forth several times a day on campus to trade him, so that the other could go to class. And so kind of my entire professional career has been as a dad. I have 4 sons. The oldest turned 7 yesterday, actually, and then the youngest is a baby. He turns 1 in November. And so, yeah, I think I am still young-ish. I turned 30 in November. I think I am not. I'm a big believer in the wisdom of our elders, and I don't think like I'm just built different. I'm never gonna burn out. You'll see. Like I have no doubt that it'll probably happen. I just think it's interesting for a lot of people. I think that the catalyst tends to be like what happened with you, Nathan, is they have kids because they're normal people and have kids when they're older. But just for me, it's all kind of been baked in since the very beginning. Um, I'm really good about like that's one reason I actually love remote work is just I see the kids throughout the day, which is great. I clock off at 5 o'clock and there's no commute. I'm upstairs with the kids immediately. And then until they go to bed, until at 7:30, I don't do any work. I don't do any school work. I don't do any podcast stuff. I'm just with them. And so I find that to be a good balance. But I mean, again, like I'm really into like that kind of like I hate the term hustle culture, but I do try to be actively engaged in something productive and meaningful pretty much every minute of the day, to the point that like people ask me like what are my hobbies. I'm like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Like, I have a podcast, does that count? Like, that doesn't count. That's a software engineering podcast. People recommend me TV shows like, you got to watch this. I'm like, when would I have the time to even watch that? So yeah, I mean, I think it's just maybe the point I'm trying to make here is that this isn't the kind of book for someone who, because I think like the very uncharitable view of this book would be like, oh, this is for lazy people who are looking for like a justification for their laziness. But I don't think it is. I think you can be someone who is really striving to make the most out of their day. And because like I'm trying to, and like I'm sure so many of us are, but tackle it in a different way that doesn't lead to burnout. Slow productivity is not the antithesis to accomplishing big, cool stuff.
Right.
Cal Newport argues it is the way to accomplish big, cool
Well,
stuff.
and I think I've seen this in other lists. I think it was it was either Charles Munger or oh shoot, what's his name? The billionaire investor, Warren Buffett. They have these like ideas that the fifth most important thing in your day is the greatest enemy to the first most important thing, right? And so like if you don't actually make room to really double down, and actually this is a fantastic segue. I won't elaborate on this yet. Part 2, we get into the principles, those 3 principles we talked about.
Yes.
And we finish this week on chapter 3, which is do fewer things. And I think that ties in really well with where my world's been and where Carter has been. And we'll get back to this after the break.
And we are back. So let's talk about chapter 3 here. This is where this is part 2 of the book. He gets into the principles. And like Nathan teed up for us at the beginning, principle 1 is do fewer things. How does he describe this? Strive to reduce your obligations to the point where you can easily imagine accomplishing them with time to spare. Leverage this reduced load to more fully embrace and advance the small number of projects that matter most. And this is the key here. He's talking about focusing on what matters the most. Says the advantage of doing fewer things, however, is about more than just increasing the raw numbers of hours dedicated to useful activity. The quality of these hours also increases. He has a great story of a mathematician, Andrew Wiles, who was kind of captivated by, I'm not mathy enough to understand what any of this stuff is, but some big unsolvable math problem called Fermat's last theorem, which he had kind of come across as a child, captivated by it, knew that he would solve it. The way his career took him, he'd kind of forgotten about it for a while, but then some breakthroughs revealed that the research he had done had become critical to solving Fermat's last theorem. Someone else had made a breakthrough that kind of tied the two together. And so he knew that it was kind of his mission in life to solve this. And so he reoriented his entire life around this. Here's how Cal Newport puts it. He says, to prepare himself to focus on a single large and meaningful project, Wiles limited large pursuits and commitments that would compete for his time. Crucially, he was systematic in this reduction. He didn't resolve in some generic fashion to try to take on less. He instead put into place specific rules. For example, no conferences, habits, work from home as much as possible, and even ploys. He actually trickled out some of his already completed research to make it look like he was researching more than he might have been. But it was all directed toward minimizing the number of big items tugging at his attention. So again, I think this is a really cool story because this is someone who they're increasing the quality of their hours. They're focusing on what really matters most, and he's still accomplishing something really cool and really audacious. I mean, Fermat's last theorem. I don't know anything about math, but that sounds neat.
It's a huge deal. And I think he was 10 years old when he was like, I want to focus on this for the rest of my life. Like it was one of these really.
That was me in Pokemon. Yeah.
I'm getting you too. Yep.
Yeah. I saw him on the game art and I thought, this is what I'll dedicate my life to. Me and Andrew Wiles are very similar. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know, Nathan, what do you, I want to talk about kind of the specific stuff he recommends here, but I also want to get your, I don't know, there's so much great stuff in this chapter. What are your thoughts about kind of this idea of doing fewer things?
Yeah, so he starts off the chapter, and again, this is a story I really loved. It was about Jane Austen, and I knew a little bit about Jane Austen because
my wife loves Jane Austen.
Yes, my wife as well. But I think our wives would get along quite well. And so,
I know, right?
But she's a vivacious reader. She's done a bunch of stuff, and she knew a little bit about the backstory. And I actually messed up a detail, and I was like retelling her. I was like, oh yeah, Jane Austen. And I think, and I said something about her son wrote about her, and then she's like, she didn't have a son. And I was like, oh, I mean, I guess it was her nephew. And and she's like, yes, that would have been fine. And so there's this whole idea, though, that somehow Jane Austen wrote all of her books in these busy moments between being like, a lady on the manor kind of like thing. And she fit all these pieces into her day. And despite all of her duties, was able to write these amazing books. And this was perpetuated by her nephew, who kind of wrote about this and his like speaking about Jane Austen and all the stuff that's going on. Turns out it's false, like absolutely false. And that there was this unique period of time when her father like shut down this school that they were running, and she was actually really busy with helping operate it. And when they shut the school down, she ended up having this amazing amount of free time for a couple of years. And that's when she actually wrote these stories. And so it was this sort of epiphany of like slowing things down, doing fewer things to focus on the most important stuff. And, what was so interesting is that she only wrote in this really small period and then unfortunately died early in her life. Like she was 40 or 41, something like that. And she changed the trajectory of literature and all of these things. And if she hadn't have had this time to do fewer things, she never would have done this huge limiting of the big goals in her life. I'm sure in the back of her mind, she probably was like, I'd love to write these books down. She probably had been playing with the ideas of characters and, all of the storyline. And then finally she had the opportunity to do it. And I love this, doing this layup into Andrew Wiles, and talking about Feynman and some other folks of like saying you have to make room to have little spats of nothing and to think deeply about the stuff you really care about. And if you don't do that, you're doing yourself a disservice, and you may never share your work with the world.
Well, I love American history, and he talks about Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
Who Benjamin Franklin was he owned kind of a couple printing press shops, and he kind of says Benjamin Franklin. You wouldn't think of him as like a mascot for slow productivity, because this is a guy who, again, I think he kind of embodies that American like go-go-go-ness. But he says he owned these printing shops, and he kept kind of expanding them, and he wanted to expand out into the West Indies, and he had hired a man. I think it was David Hall was the name. I don't remember the name exactly, but he hires this man to run the new printing shop in the West Indies. But the man gets very, very sick and just cannot relocate to the West Indies. But Franklin liked him so much and thought he was such a sharp guy that he was like, you know what? Maybe I'll hang up my hat at the Philadelphia printing press, and I'll let Hall run this one, right? And I won't make as much money, but it'll give me time to sort of focus on some other things. So he does that, and then with this time, what does Ben Franklin focus on? The theory of electricity. He becomes a representative in the Pennsylvania Assembly, right? Which of course leads to he's able to focus more on his writing, and this leads to him becoming a delegate to the Continental Congress, and obviously a very influential American leader. So this is not it's doing fewer things, but not doing it's focusing on bigger things. And I just really liked his examples, again, because the very uncharitable way to read this book is it's a justification for laziness. But he's who's he volunteering as exemplars of this philosophy? Andrew Wiles, Jane Austen, Benjamin Franklin, right? Any one of us, can you imagine your name being ranked amongst these men and women? Insane. And so, I don't know, to me, I thought this is a great way to contextualize the book. One, because the stories are very fun to read. But two, because, it's very aspirational to me. And it makes me want to be more, I've always wanted to be more like these great men and women. And you think, well, the way to be like these great men and women is you have that kind of colloquial understanding of Jane Austen as, well, this is a woman who was writing on scraps of paper in between sentences. But that's not the case. She got all of her best work done during a slower period of her life when she could focus on what really mattered.
Yeah, I love that. From the Benjamin Franklin section, I think in his autobiography, he there's these famous platitudes. One of them is like lose no time and be always employed in something useful, which you can see this hustle culture thing. It was him, because I think a lot of his fortune he made was actually from having these newspapers and printing presses that he would operate as franchises in various areas. And so, he was already thinking about industrious sort of behaviors, but he actually later in life realized he couldn't sustain this, where he was just hustle, hustle, hustle all the time. And he said, I'm settling my old accounts and hope soon to be quite a master of my own time. And, he actually says trading time for money, right? Or money for time, I should say. And that gets into this really kind of cool idea, which is that he basically like set aside about half his fortune for someone to run the operations of his businesses, so that he would have more time to work on these deep questions that he had, right? The lightning in a bottle, and with the kite and all these other, he was constantly inventing things. And I think if he had been just focused on the operations of those successful businesses, he would have had a very wealthy life. But would he have had those deep, rewarding experiences if he hadn't made room for them? And
Absolutely. So he has some kind of propositions, some tactics on how can you actually apply this? What does it mean to focus on fewer things and to remain, again, to still be productive, to still be accomplishing and delivering meaningful goals, either for your business or for your personal life, but to be doing it in kind of a slower, more productive way. So, Nathan, is this a good time to pivot into tactics?
Yeah. So I think framing this, and I'll just kind of give a high level, and then I think go straight into the tactics. The structure is actually proposition, then there's sort of a piece of advice on how to do it, and then there's actually tactics. And I think so to kind of frame these, so to go into Andrew Wild's, the proposition is to limit the big things that you're working on, right? So ideally, that's one big thing or a couple of big things. But then the way he says to structure this, which is interesting, is he says, okay, we should have the limit to the number of missions, which is, he said that the term mission might sound grandiose. For our purposes, we demote it to a more pragmatic definition: any ongoing goal or service that directs your professional life, right? So missions are the things that serve the big thing that you're doing. And then amongst missions, you have projects. Projects are like the little like quests that you go on, right? You're going on a quest to accomplish your mission. The projects might be the actual like way that you're starting to structure your work. And he gets into this all the way down to like you should set daily goals, and that the daily goals should only include one project that you're working on as the goal for the day. Not to say that you won't answer emails or go to meetings or do these other things, but that you need to like. So there's this like sort of nested Russian doll nested limitations of I do a goal tied to a project per day. I have a limited number of projects, and then I have a limited number of missions, and that this is sort of the structure that we should think about. And this is where all the tactics kind of tie in to like, how do I actually accomplish this?
So I loved all these tactics because again, I think it's great when a book isn't just platitudes, but has sections where it's like, okay, what does this mean? What does this actually look like in your day-to-day life? Here's one of the tactics. He says, you put tasks on autopilot.
Yeah.
He talks about like autopilot. He says he kind of came to this knowledge when he was a student and would write about productivity like for other students. Says, you know, if you've ever been a student, especially in college, like, you know that it's very common to kind of put everything off until the last minute. And he said, you should put tasks on autopilot. Like, I always do my lit reading on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 o'clock. He even said, like, do them at the same table in the library. Or always, he talks about a professor who always reviews grant research, but before they do that, they always get a coffee at the student center. They always walk across the green. And then they go review their grants, just this kind of ritual. He says, in the context of knowledge work, it turns out autopilot schedules provide an effective means to contain tasks. Instead of setting regular times each week for completing school assignments, you can set times for accomplishing specific categories of regularly occurring tasks. A freelancer, for example, might schedule sending invoices for Monday morning, while a professor might schedule reviewing grant reports for Friday right after lunch. Once you get used to accomplishing a specific type of task at the same times on the same days, the overhead required for their execution plummets. Because that's something we haven't quite talked about specifically, but is a big point he makes in the book, that if you have, say, 5 missions or 5 goals in a day, a certain amount of time, there's an overhead tax that comes in switching between them. And so one of the ways you can reclaim time in your day, eliminate pseudo-productivity, right, and focus on what really matters, is by limiting that overhead. One of the ways you can limit overhead is just by putting tasks on autopilot, right? If you're the kind of person who has to fill out a lot of expense reports, right, then just set aside 2 hours, and every Monday, block it off on your calendar. That's the expense report time. I'm trying to think of, like, as a developer.
Well, I don't
know. What do you think, Nathan?
This ties in really well. So here's a good example. I have a podcast called Functionally Imperative, and we have a podcast that I'm a co-host on called Book Overflow. Book Overflow, whether we did it consciously or not, has an autopilot cadence. Every Wednesday morning, we get up bright and early and record this thing right now.
Yep.
We have a built-in cadence, which is we have to get the book read by around the night before, and have to get all of our notes in for this. And so those are non-negotiable, right? We it's not like I'm like figuring out what I'm doing. Maybe we negotiate where we stop in the book, something like this. But the book's being read, we talk about it, and then a lot of the success, I think, of Book Overflow has been the cadence that we've set, where Functionally Imperative has been, it's like a pet project of mine. And it's something where I'm like, take my time and I like look, but I need to put on the good example. I need to put on autopilot, reach out to folks. I just haven't done that in a regular basis. And it kind of like, I try to fit it in my gaps, and it's a terrible way of doing it. So I should go back and say, you know what? this 1 hour window, I'm going to reach out to 5 people, right? And just do this once a week. And that's just my cadence. Um, and I think and this is part of this proposition called containing the small, meaning there's a lot of small tasks you have to do. So think about it. He also, in other books, he's talked about batching work. Like, oh, I have to write emails or I have to respond to Slack. I don't want to interrupt my whole day, so I'll do it in a batch. The autopilot is like a fantastic approach to saying, here's the cadence, here's this like regular interval, and then you reduce the cognitive overload. And I love it.
Yeah, you're talking about kind of this podcast, and I'm putting things on autopilot. I didn't even recognize that this is what I was doing, but I just got to the point where there have been one or two books where I've kind of we record on Wednesday, where I have furiously been reading them Tuesday night, and like I hate it. I'm like, it's not a fun way to consume these books, and so I thought, like, I just gotta set aside more time to this, and so I actually moved my phone charger to the other side of the room. And so then because I love my Kindle, that's what I read everything on the Kindle, and that is allowed to live right next to my bed, right? But then when I settle in for bed, I take my watch off, my phone, I put it all on the charger, and it's just kind of nice to like separate. And I say, okay, now all I'm going to do is read, right? And so I've put that on autopilot. So one, I read in the evening, but two, I'm actually making my laziness work for me, because I'm like, oh, I'll just read the book in the morning, but I'm lazy in the morning, right? Like right when I wake up. And so I never want to do the comparatively harder thing of reading the book. And I always go to Twitter. But now if I'm too lazy to read a book, I'm definitely too lazy to get up and walk across the room. And so all I have is the Kindle next to me. And it's led really naturally into I just spend the first 20 or 30 minutes of the day in bed reading. And then it's actually freed up time to read even more fiction at night. Actually, I'm reading Red Mars by Kim Stanley Hudson, I think. I don't know. And yeah, really, really interesting book about kind of like it's fiction about like the colonization of Mars. If you're into that sort of stuff, you should check it out. Anyhow, but I didn't realize, but yeah, this is something I'm doing. I'm just putting it on autopilot, and that might require. I've talked about that, and I think it was last week where I said, like, I would love to be playing Nintendo more often with my kids. They love it. I really get enjoyment out of it, but it was hard having the controllers charged, and so I just bought some wireless chargers, and now we have a place for them. Same with moving my charger across the room. I find that altering my physical environment to facilitate these things actually works out really well. And actually, Nathan, if you don't have any more thoughts on this, it's a really good segue into one of the other tactics we talked about, spending money. Do you want to talk about that, or do you have any closing thoughts on this?
No. This is great. Actually, before we move on to spending money, because I think that's a really good one, office hours. So
yes. Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's do office hours, because it ties into autopilot, and then it'll segue well into the spending money.
Yes.
So this is actually, I had a manager who encouraged this, and I didn't realize what a cool slow productivity piece was, which was my platform engineering team. We're always trying to set expectations and introduce ideas and patterns to enable and empower engineers at the company. And a lot of times we'll get these little requests, like little teams wanting to be innovative, and we don't want to shut them down, but we can't just field a bunch of like random requests in the middle of the week, or we'd never get our other tasks done. And so we hold a regular office hours once a week, and it's a place to always invite people. And of course, this takes you from academia, right? This makes total sense that Cal Newport is talking about this, because this is what professors do. You hold an office hours, and they go, okay, every Wednesday at this time, I'm going to be in my office. You can come stop by. And unfortunately, I didn't take advantage of office hours nearly enough when I was undergrad. I used it a lot, actually, for things like graduate algorithms at Georgia Tech, where it was an essential part of the culture. But it's a regular interval in which you can engage deeply and take the opportunity. And if you're in a highly collaborative environment and you feel overwhelmed, I highly encourage office hours. It's probably one of the most powerful and successful things, because it gives them a little friction. If they really care enough to interrupt your time, they'll gather their thoughts and they'll come to office hours. They will rearrange their schedule. They know this is when I'll get my answers for my questions. And then you have to come up to the other side of it and be present and available and be able to answer these questions. It was amazing, and it was transformative. And when we did this, we reduced a lot of frustration on both sides, right? What you don't want to do is lock up and go, gosh, here they come again. Like, I have another request that I'm going to have to like drop everything and go do this. And then there's probably thinking the same thing of like, oh, platform engineering is gonna, I need to ask them this thing, but do they even have time to talk to me? And office hours completely changed that, which was really cool.
I hear office hours and I get PTSD
Uh-oh.
because, well, I just when I worked at this big cloud provider, we had office hours, and if you were on call, you had to attend the office hours. And our product was so big and so complicated, and turnover at this company was so high,
Oh boy.
and our users of the product were like, a lot of them were internal, and so kind of understood the product in some ways better than we did. And
Yeah.
it was just the worst because we just get very, very specific questions
Interesting.
about like, yes, and I was like, I don't know what the freak that means. Yeah, like I don't even, sometimes even just the basic terms, I'm like, I no no, you're talking about, component C, but I have focused exclusively on components A, B, E, and
Mm.
F. I'm only vaguely aware that component C exists. And so, yeah, I just,
So,
our on calls were brutal, like 80, 90 pages a week, brutal.
wow.
And office hours are still the things I would dread the most, to the point where I loved when I was primary on call and I got paged before office hours started. And I just threw secondary to the wolves. I'm like, all right, you handle office hours now.
Yeah. And
So
that
I love the idea of office hours, just
no, but
that
you
particular.
could overuse it though, right? Like it doesn't fix the fact that they're processes that do need to be in place. And if you're abusing office hours, and I would say that's a good example of this, is where it's like, it's like the public town forum where they get to, be angry about everything.
Yeah.
Um, so two things to tie into the spending money piece, because I think spending money is like a really important tactic, and one that we're hoping to do more of with Book Overflow as we grow, um, is making people work more. He calls this the
Hmm.
reverse task list. And again, I think this is interesting in that, and this might sound very bureaucratic of like having to do a submission form and fill out, these details. Um, but it can be really useful if you're struggling with these like last minute, ill-defined lists of work. And he ties this actually into avoiding the task engine. I think that's the other piece that
This
he
was
ties
so
into.
fascinating to me because the example he kind of gives with avoiding the task engine, he says, okay, let's say that you have two tasks in front of you, right? One of them is reading and understanding, like doing a lot of research on this particular component of your system and then writing a report based on it, right? You could imagine if this were, in software engineering, if there was a part of your system that was ill-defined and needed some documentation written up, right? It says, or you can, another task is to organize a one-day conference for professionals in the industry. He's talking about academia, but you could imagine this. Let's say you're trying to organize, you're a remote team, and you're trying to organize an on-site for maybe your team, and to make it a little more apt, maybe you're trying to coordinate with two other teams. Which is actually something that I'm trying to do right now. It says a lot of people, when choosing between these two tasks, would say, I'll choose to organize the onsite because that seems a lot simpler than reading and understanding this part of the system and writing the documentation. He says you should choose the documentation instead because it's not a task engine. He says organizing the onsite is going to continue generating task after task after task, because you're going to have to organize schedules, figure out hotels, talk to caterers, come up with an agenda, clear the agenda with other members of the team, things like that. It's just going to keep generating tasks. The documentation, it won't generate any tasks. You can just focus on that from start to finish. I just thought that was a really interesting way of comparing two competing priorities. I'd never heard of that before.
Yeah, and I've slipped into this several times with my current employer. There's a couple of projects that were hidden task engines where I
Mm.
realized so little attention in the organization had been paid to actually, like, we talk about something. Oh yeah, one day conference, this kind of idea. Or for us, it would be like blue green deploy for this legacy application, and then you realize that, well, blue green deploy really means the way that we structure our repos has to change. Oh, and actually the build process for the machine images has to change. And oh, we have all these dependencies that have to get updated for us to like update the build process. And then all of a sudden you get this like task list that is nothing to do with blue green, but everything to do with blue green, right? And so yeah, I've fallen into this gap. This is probably the area that like I feel called out because I'm like a task engine magnet. So I will I'm like, that sounds exciting. Let's do that. That's a cool problem to solve. And then tactically I get into this like black hole of, endless tasks of like, are we going to accomplish this? Is this even possible? And so yeah. So
Well, so another one he talks about spending money. Says this can
yes.
be a little life hack, right? It's something that I've learned. And listen, folks, we get some of you are listening to this and you're students, right? Maybe some of you are listening to this and you maybe you're not at the earning potential you want to quite be at in your career, right? And so we're not saying we know that not everyone can spend money on to reduce their tasks, right? But I've also met too many people who make $400,000 a year and refuse to spend money to kind of to free themselves up. I mean, so what does that mean, right? Um, it means he actually gives the example of software services. He's talking about a consultant he knows, Jenny. She says, Jenny sent me a spreadsheet of every software subscription she maintains for her business, including its monthly cost. She wasn't kidding about her commitment to going pro with these tools. The sheet includes over 50 paid services from Calendly to DocuSign to the professional version of Zoom, adding up to roughly $2,400 a month in subscription fees. There's a good reason, however, for this expense. These professional software services eliminate or simplify administrative work. Jenny's investing serious money, in other words, to seriously reduce the size of her task list. And this is just something I feel so strongly. We do it a bit with Book Overflow. We pay money for Riverside, our podcasting software, right? We could do this on the freemium version of Zoom and it'd be a nightmare, right? That would require a lot more manual editing on our parts, right? When we schedule, we used to kind of trying to schedule the our author guests. I was just emailing back and forth and consulting with Nathan and saying, okay, well, does this time work for you? Does this time work for you? And we just gave in and said, you know what, Calendly, it's not that expensive. And we just went ahead and bought it. And it's been a breeze scheduling from
Oh
now
yeah.
on.
So much easier.
I pay $3 a month for Twitter so that we can do long posts so that when the account automatically tweets out quotes, I don't have to do any sort of overhead and only tweeting out smaller quotes.
And we also do it like I'm a big fan of reducing the pain. So for instance, my wife and I love having a clean house, like clean and
Mhm.
tidy house. This is something that I'm very from a messy family and messy by nature, but I also enjoy like the peace that it brings for having a nice tidy house, and it really is important to my wife. We both work though, and so we have a cleaning service that comes in once a week, which is very aggressive by how we would have done things earlier in our careers and our lives. But we make enough money now, and it's something we prioritize, and it's something we pay for, and it removes a lot of like stress. And obviously we still try to keep the house tidy. We obviously are cleaning the kitchen and doing stuff during the week, but when it comes to like mopping all the floors, cleaning the bathrooms, doing this other stuff, we let other folks do this, and it takes this whole aspect of like draining time and energy. And I think it's a huge tactic of being like, if you're in a position to and you can and you value it, there's something about spending money to solve a problem that can be just really liberating, right? You don't have it in the back of your mind going, oh, I gotta clean the bathroom, like I got these 5 other things I have to do, but it just took it off our plate. And it's not just professional stuff, right? Like
Oh
Calendly
yeah.
is no brainer. Like nothing is less professional looking than having to go back and forth with,
Yeah.
a prolific author and then be like, oh, this work on your calendar? It's like a game of telephone. And that one little switch made a huge difference.
Well, you talk about personally. I actually just am experiencing this in my life. Little personal backstory on me. I love to eat. I love food. It's like my favorite thing in the entire world. And part of the reason my red blooded Americanness recoiled at the besmirching of fast food is that like I love Taco Bell. It's like
Oh my
I
gosh.
make once a week. I have a ritual of going there. I'm friends with the manager there. They know my name. Um, and yeah, I just love Taco Bell so much. Um, and so like I can eat a ton. And actually during college I put on a significant amount of weight. I put on about 60 pounds. So I used to be about 60 pounds heavier than you see me right now. um, and then also during college at senior year I lost it all. And I lost it all by eating nothing all day until the evening, where I would eat Taco Bell for dinner every night.
Oh,
It
hero
was the
fasting.
Taco Bell
Yeah.
diet. Yeah, basically, I didn't realize it was intermittent fasting, but what I knew at the time was I thought I'm okay being hungry all day if I can eat something I really, really enjoy in the evening. And for me, that was Taco Bell. It's a terrible, not healthy way to lose weight, but it was better than having all the weight. Anyhow, but as I've gotten in my career, like I can't just be hungry all day. We're doing cognitive work. It's not a strategy. And I've tried for, I'm not as healthy as I'd like to be right now. And so I've just tried for months having my own spreadsheets or tracking systems or whatever to try to lose weight or gain weight or put on muscles or whatever. And it's so much administrative overhead. And I wasn't seeing the results I did. And so I said, you know what? Screw it. I'm paying for a personal trainer. And it's expensive, right? Like I'm not gonna lie, folks. It's not cheap. And so I'm not saying, hey, everyone, you know what you should do? You should pay a personal trainer because I know it's not possible for everyone. But especially if you're a more senior software engineer, you tend to be highly compensated. You tend to have more money than most people. And I was talking to my wife about this. I'm like, if we're not spending the money on this, because we save a ton of our money, I was like, if we're not spending on this, what are we spending on? Like, this is our
Right.
health. This is what matters. And it's been such a relief for me to take the administrative overhead. I just have this professional, and I say, well, what should I be eating? And I've been so focused on losing weight. And I met this guy, and this guy looks exactly like how I would love to look, and he's very healthy and active and fit and strong. And I found out that he's only slightly taller than me. He weighs much more than I do. And so when we talk, I've been trying to lose weight for so long, and he comes to me, he's like, no, man. He's like, right now, you got to put on some weight. And which, I mean, I'm not saying whether you need to lose weight or put on weight or whatever. What I'm saying is paying someone to take that administrative overhead
Right.
away from me and to say, let me just tell you what you need to do to be the kind of healthy you want to be. Huge. And it's been
Yeah.
such a quality of life improvement for me. I just started last week. And so, um, if you're looking at me and saying like, what personal trainer are you paying for? Because it's not working out, but we're at the beginning of the process, folks. But even just this last week, feeling that weight, that administrative weight off my shoulders, huge. And so
Yep.
there's a lot of value, if you can, to spending a little bit of money to simplify your life and focus on what's truly important.
And I had a friend from high school who, is a good example of somebody who's very thrifty and gets to a certain point in his career where he thinks that this is like something that wealthy people do, like paying for services or solving certain problems this way. And of course, I see it as the opposite of like, if this frees up a little bit more of my time out of my day and it's replacing something I don't really enjoy doing on my own, it's such a good investment. And you're honoring the professional path of someone else, right? Personal trainer, they've spent years
Absolutely.
becoming an expert in this, and you get to take advantage of that. There's no way that you could reach that level because you're not, again, it's not your mission. It's not your
Yeah.
primary goal. You're not going to, you'd have to sacrifice a lot of other important things to you to get on their level of being good enough at understanding that sort of, professional, um, professionalism that they have. And it's the same reason for us. Like we're in software engineering, right? The product, the CEO, all the other folks in the company, the sales team, they need specialized talent to offload, part of the load for them as well. And so, yeah, this one was a really cool one because it's like, hey, this is a tactic that you can take if you're in a position to spend money. Just solve that problem that way, right? It's I think there's like some old self-help book my mom told me about a long time ago, and she's like, if money can solve the problem, it's not really a problem.
Yeah.
Right. And again, obviously, if you have to have access to that money. If it's $1 million that'll solve your problem, and you don't have $1 million, then obviously it's still a problem.
But there are some things,
Yeah.
again, like I brought it up a couple times, but just buying these chargers for my kids' Nintendo
Yeah.
controllers, like $75. And again, if you're a student, that might
Right.
be a lot too. I'm actually surprised by how many of our listeners are students. Thank you so much for listening. I think you're getting a good head start in your career by listening to this podcast. But again, if you are a software engineer, especially stationed in America, like you've got $75. And so and what was cool about that to me was this wasn't $75 for like a novelty or a gimmick. Heaven knows I've spent $75 on something like that was not worth $75. But I thought the only thing, this is a weird barrier to me spending quality time with my kids. And you're telling me $75 would solve it?
Yep.
That's insane.
Yep.
And so it's not saying, oh, get the premium version of everything, right? Go subscribe to everything you possibly can. But if there are things that are introducing friction in your life that are resulting in pseudo productivity, giving you administrative overhead, and you can pay a little bit of money to reduce it, I agree, and Cal Newport supports
Yep. Well,
this. It's worth it.
this was the last little anecdote here on my side is that a couple of years ago, my daughter she's she's in fourth grade now, but I think she was coming out of first grade, and this was the kids who were deeply impacted by the COVID school shutdowns.
Oh yeah.
Which I think is not talked about nearly enough of like a really unfortunate side effect of policy, because these kids needed this interaction and they weren't getting it. And so my daughter reverted, like she really regressed in her mathematics skills and reading, but and we were working with her, but it's just a lot of stress for a kid, and
Yeah.
it just wasn't in a good spot. To the point that we actually thought about repeating a grade, which repeating a grade is not an easy process anymore. You actually have to do like an incredible, talking about reverse task lists. You have to the principal has to sign off on it and two teachers have to sign off on it, and nobody wants to do it. My daughter's really young for her class. Like she's barely made the cutoff of how young you can be. And my wife was like, what if we put her in tutoring over the summer? And it was like this aha moment of like, oh yeah, like tutoring. We can just pay for tutoring. And we tried it. It was way less effort than repeating the grade and going through all that other stuff. And there was a lot of reasons like we didn't want her to repeat the grade because all of her friends would be a grade ahead of her. And there's all this this social stigma stuff around it. And so we tried tutoring, and she's still going to tutoring now. What's interesting is that she did not regress that summer. And she's so confident in mathematics that she loves being a little bit ahead of expectations. And it's just become this cadence that she has. It's the autopilot thing where she just works on the juicy stuff, the stuff that she maybe is struggling with, or she needs a little one-on-one attention. And it's something that we've been really happy to invest in, right? And again, it's that whole idea of spending money if you have it, if you have the means to do it. It has taken something that was very stressful. Math was something she just thought she wasn't good at, that she couldn't do. And now math is this interesting tool that lets her solve other problems. She loves, computer stuff, and she loves Lego, and she loves science. And she now understands that like math is the thing you have to be, proficient in to do those other things. And so last anecdote.
Well, I think the central idea throughout that idea of spending money is if it's important, if it's going to free you up to focus on more important things, that it's absolutely what you should be doing. We're not encouraging you just to go wild on spending on every sort of premium good you can get. There's lots of stuff, believe me folks, there's lots of stuff that is not worth the money. But as you know your life, you know what's important to you. If there's something that would really free you up to focus on what's most important, you should really consider spending the money to get you there. I mean, it has been a fantastic discussion of tactics. I think, Nathan, is there anything else you want to cover before we take a quick break and then wrap up?
Yeah, I don't think we should go into detail because actually I think this is a little bit of preaching to the choir. The last proposition is this whole idea of pull versus push. We can go into it if you want to, and we can do it after the break if you want to. Otherwise, I can just give it a little nod, and then we can.
Well, why don't we just give it a little nod?
Okay.
We want to
So
respect our listeners' time.
Any of us in computer science, and especially if you're working professionally as a programmer, you probably understand this already. This is basically what Jira and Scrum boards and Kanban are all about. It's this idea that if you don't have a process, everyone's just going to ask you to do a bunch of things, drop everything that you're doing, and then you're going to get really stressed out. I think those of us in programming have gotten used to at least having an intake process where we have a backlog. We do backlog grooming. So, there's an intake procedure. There's a ritual our team does to prioritize work. We accomplish this work and then we pull in more stuff. Instead of letting everyone push work on us, we describe all the work and then we pull it onto our plate as we're ready. And so he kind of gives some cool tactics on like how to use Trello boards and some other stuff for personal productivity. Absolutely worth reading about, but not something I think we need to get into great detail because, again, it's not a new concept for most folks who might be our audience.
Yeah, I would agree. But I think it does speak to the importance of I know some people kind of like buck against the idea of process. I think I'm anti process, right?
I love all your anti stuff.
I know, right? Well, let's take a quick break and then we'll be back with kind of our closing thoughts on the book. And we are back. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in as we wrap up our discussion of the first half of Slow Productivity. I'm glad we didn't try to read this book all in 1 week because it would have felt hypocritical. But as always, please please chime in with your thoughts on the podcast, on our reading pace. Like we mentioned, we did about 110 pages this week. When we first started, we would have aimed to do 220 and get it all done in 1 week. But we hope that you are feeling that this is high quality discussion and that by slowing down a bit, we're able to provide you with the best understanding and the most interesting ideas of what come out of the book. But really, this podcast is for you folks. The only reason we do this is to, one, we like reading the books ourselves, but the reason we publish it and go through all the effort of making it available for you is so that you can get the most out of it. So if you feel like you're getting a lot out of these podcasts, please comment, like, subscribe, send us an email at contact@bookoverflow.io. And if you'd like us to pick up the pace, we want to hear that too. Really, we're trying to make the best podcast possible for you, the listener. So we love hearing from that or that kind of stuff from you. Let's talk about our standard wrap-up questions. We always like to say at the end, what are we going to do differently in our career? And I suppose in this book, maybe in our lives, as a result of having read this book. Nathan, what are you feeling after the first half of Slow Productivity?
Yeah, so do fewer things is the chapter we ended on. And this is the thing that really stuck with me. I have a tendency to let doing too much creep in. And so one of the things I plan on doing this week is reevaluating what are my 2 to 3 missions and getting in alignment with my projects and goals that go into that, which means removing things that don't fit into that. And so I actually have a couple of ideas of where that might take me, but I'll I'd love to update everyone. I will tell you, Book Overflow stays on the short list of things that is not a doing too much.
What are we going to do differently in our career? We're canceling the podcast.
Yeah, right. No, this one has been an amazing thing. And obviously building a mission around this, I think is a really cool idea of like, is it Book Overflow itself, or is it a larger goal in, podcasting or content creation, and that Book Overflow helps serve that mission? It'll be fun to think about. What about you?
Yeah, putting tasks on autopilot really resonated with me. I'm actually proud of how my executive functioning skills have gotten pretty good as a software engineer, and I'm really good about like anytime I have a task come my way, I'm really good about writing it down just so it doesn't float off into the ether. I'm really good about taking notes throughout the day about kind of the technologies I'm working with or information I'm learning about the business. I have a habit with myself. I always write myself in Slack when the day ends and basically write a message to myself like, okay, this is the first thing you're going to work on tomorrow morning, just so I kind of keep it. Because I'm the kind of guy who can have trouble getting started with something. So I'm proud of how far my executive functioning skills have come, but it does result in kind of like a big old task list. And then I wind up engaging in a lot of pseudo-productivity, right? And so I'm going to look at this idea of putting tasks on autopilot more and try to take a look at the tasks that are populating my list and figuring out, are there any similar buckets that some of these things are in? And then I'm actually going to take a page out of Uncle Bob's book, which he mentions in Clean Coder. One thing I'm really bad at is starting the day with my easiest tasks, because I'm like, okay, I'll just get into the workday real quick. But Uncle Bob correctly points out the beginning of the day is often we have the most energy. And so we really should be tackling our biggest, hardest stuff there. Um, so I'm going to look into maybe trying to block off like at 3 p.m., especially because a lot of my coworkers are Eastern time, so they sign off around that time. Like if I can just kind of schedule maybe like Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m., figure out if there's any sort of recurring tasks that are eating up a lot of my time and just say, you know what, I don't worry about those. And they don't even make it on my regular to-do list. Maybe I have a special to-do list just so that it winds up on that list. And then when that 3 o'clock comes around, I say, okay, this is the time where I review all my pull requests, or this is the time where I create all my attributes. I don't know, right? I still need to categorize it, but I love that idea of just getting things off of that main list into their own segmented buckets of time. And that'll free me up to focus on what's more important and to deliver better high value projects for my organization and the business.
That reminds me of
That's
the
what's top of mind for me.
Scott Talinsky had that recommendation for Eat That Frog, which is a book
Oh
about
yeah.
doing the hard thing first. And like
Yeah.
21, I think it's like 21 tactics for it. I read it years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's helpful in that area.
And we try to have in the YouTube episode description, we can't get in Spotify quite yet, but for the YouTube episode description, we try to link to all of the books that we mention. They are paid Amazon affiliate links. Please, by all means, if that's something you're not comfortable with, I know some people aren't for some reason, but please, we want you to support the author. So go to Amazon yourself and purchase the book if you're interested in. But if you want to support the podcast and are interested in these books, we do provide them in the YouTube description for you to purchase. And yeah, we because we just I hope it's a theme you're catching throughout this podcast where we keep referencing books we've read before, and we can kind of tie these ideas together. And so it's just really been cool reading so many books and realizing where there's these overlaps, and I don't know, helps me feel more confident in the decisions I'm making in my life.
For sure.
Nathan, who would you recommend Slow Productivity to after reading the first half?
This is such an approachable book. It's really anyone who feels overwhelmed. If you feel like you are doing a lot of busy work, but you for some reason aren't getting your big goals done. I mean, there isn't a better book in my mind at the moment, especially if you're doing knowledge work, especially if you're in our field, and let's say you've leveled up in your career recently, got a promotion or something like this. That's exactly the time you should introspect and look at, am I approaching this the right way? Am I using the right tactics? Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I just think anyone who's feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I think there's like a common meme among software engineers, like, "Oh, I'm going to quit and become a farmer." And one, we romanticize like living off the land, right? I just want to point out for our listeners that all of human history has been an endeavor to get off subsistence farming, right? Like, so I think we glamorize kind of like farm life a little too much. But I think people say like, I would always talk about it in school, like becoming like an Icelandic shepherd, right? And I think because you get overwhelmed and you just think, screw it, I'm done with all of this. But I think if you're a software engineer, a lot of us are here because at the end of the day, we find software engineering fascinating. We find the tools we work with really cool. And I think a lot of us do want to accomplish meaningful stuff with our lives and our careers. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed, but also recognize that maybe quitting and going and becoming a farmer isn't quite a valid strategy, check out this book, because I really do think there is harmony with having a meaningful life, not burning yourself out, but still engaging with the stuff you find fascinating, which for us is software engineering, and still accomplishing really big, cool stuff. Again, like Jane Austen or Benjamin Franklin. So I just think, yeah, if you're feeling sort of trapped in the rat race, but still derive a lot of satisfaction and identity from computer programming, like this is the book for you. And I really do hope you'll check it out and take it from, someone like Nathan who has, settled into or had the realization that he needs to be moving slower, and someone like me who still is kind of go, go, go. We're both finding lots of great stuff out of this book. And so
Right.
I really don't think you have to have one specific kind of personality to take to it. It's really just a great book for pretty much anyone. Well, I think that about wraps it up for the podcast this week. We will be back with more discussion of the second half of Slow Productivity by Cal Newport next week. And as always, please feel free to connect with us, right? You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. Hit us up on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it at Book Overflow Pod. I'm on Twitter or X at Book Overflow Pod. And as Nathan talked about his podcast, Functionally Imperative, where he interviews fascinating other creative folk, you can find all the information about where to find that at www.functionallyimperative.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for bringing us up to 3,000 subscribers on YouTube. We really can't thank you enough. So excited about the future of this podcast. So excited about the present and everything we've been able to accomplish because of your listening. And we hope that you'll keep tuning in because we enjoy making this podcast and we hope that you're enjoying listening to it. We'll see you around next week, folks.